The hill rises from the dry earth of southeastern Turkey like something half-remembered. For thousands of years, shepherds walk across it without knowing what lies underneath. Wind pushes through pale grass. Flint fragments glitter in the dust. Broken limestone sticks out from the ground in strange angles that do not quite resemble natural rock. Local villagers call the place Potbelly Hill, Gobekli Tepe. Nothing about it seems extraordinary at first glance. It is only another swell of earth in a landscape filled with ruins older than memory. Then the stones begin to emerge. Not loose stones, not collapsed walls, pillars. Massive carved pillars buried deep beneath the hill, arranged in circles so old that no known civilization should have existed when they were raised. Long before the pyramids of Egypt, before the first cities of Mesopotamia, before writing, before bronze, before wheels, before what most people would even recognize as civilization itself. And suddenly, one of the oldest assumptions about human history begins to crack, because Gobekli Tepe should not exist. The oldest civilizations, according to the traditional story, appear after agriculture. Farming creates surplus food. Surplus food creates settlements. Settlements create hierarchy, religion, labor specialization, architecture, cities, kings, monuments. Civilization rises step by careful step. That is how the story is supposed to work. But on this hill, buried beneath layers of earth and silence, archaeologists uncover evidence that humans are building monumental stone sanctuaries nearly 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. And the builders are not urban citizens living behind walls. They are not subjects of a king. They may not even be farmers yet. The deeper the excavation goes, the stranger the place becomes. At the center of massive stone rings stand towering T-shaped pillars weighing several tons each. Some are carved with foxes, snakes, vultures, boars, insects, wild cattle, cranes, gazelles, and creatures difficult to identify. The carvings are precise, deliberate, alive with movement. Many of the pillars appear almost human, with arms, hands, belts, and loincloths carved into the stone. Yet no faces emerge. The figures stand silent and anonymous, staring across 12,000 years. No houses appear beside the earlier structures, no streets, no obvious signs of permanent urban life. The site looks ceremonial. But for whom? And why would hunter-gatherers invest enormous labor into carving and transporting giant stones long before cities supposedly exist? The questions multiply faster than the answers. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of Gobekli Tepe does not simply add another chapter to ancient history, it changes the beginning of the book itself. The hill sits near the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent, a region stretching across parts of modern Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and the Levant. Today the landscape can feel harsh and dry beneath the summer heat. But 12,000 years ago the world here is changing dramatically. The last ice age is ending. Great glaciers still cling to distant mountains, but temperatures are rising. Rainfall patterns shift unpredictably. Grasslands spread across broad valleys. Herds of gazelle move through the plains in astonishing numbers. Wild wheat and barley grow naturally across the hillsides. Human beings have already survived unimaginable hardship by this point. Anatomically, modern humans have existed for hundreds of thousands of years. They have crossed deserts, coastlines, and frozen steppes. They have painted caves in Europe, hunted mammoths in Siberia, sailed to islands, buried their dead, shaped bone flutes, carved figurines, and adapted to nearly every environment on Earth. But permanent civilization still lies far in the future, or so it once seemed. For most of human existence, people live in small mobile bands. They move with seasons, animal migrations, water availability, and changing vegetation. The image of prehistoric hunter-gatherers as primitive wanderers survives stubbornly in popular imagination. But the evidence tells a more complicated story. Many Ice Age societies possess sophisticated ecological knowledge, social structures, symbolic traditions, and long-distance trade networks. They understand landscapes intimately. They remember migration routes across generations. They survive not because life is simple, but because their understanding of the natural world is extraordinarily refined. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that the people who gather near Gobekli Tepe belong to this transitional world, a world balanced between mobility and settlement, between hunting and farming, between Ice Age survival and something entirely new. Yet even among prehistoric sites, Gobekli Tepe feels unsettlingly advanced. The first modern archaeological survey arrives in the 1960s, but the hill is misidentified as little more than a medieval cemetery. Scattered limestone fragments seem unremarkable. The true significance remains hidden for decades. Then, in the 1990s, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt begins re-examining the site. He notices worked stone protruding from the soil and realizes almost immediately that this place is far older than anyone assumed. Excavations begin carefully. Dust comes away in layers. More pillars emerge, then more. Circular enclosures appear beneath the hill like buried chambers from another age. Some pillars rise over 5 meters tall. Others remain partially unfinished, abandoned in nearby quarries as if work suddenly stopped. The sheer scale of labor becomes difficult to explain. Moving stones this heavy requires coordination, planning, manpower, tools, and shared purpose, and all of it predates pottery. That detail alone shocks archaeologists. Pottery is normally associated with settled life, yet Gobekli Tepe belongs to the pre-pottery Neolithic period, a stage so early that many technologies later civilizations take for granted do not yet exist. No metal tools shape these stones. No domesticated draft animals haul them uphill. No wheeled carts carry materials across the landscape. The people here accomplish monumental construction using stone tools, rope, muscle, and organization. The old timeline begins to wobble. For generations, historians assume organized religion emerges after agriculture and urban society. But Gobekli Tepe hints at the reverse possibility. Perhaps shared ritual comes first. Perhaps gathering for ceremonies creates pressure for more stable food supplies. Perhaps belief itself helps pull humanity towards civilization. Scholars still debate exactly what the site represents. No single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence. Some researchers see a ritual center drawing scattered groups together seasonally. Others argue for early forms of social hierarchy. A few more speculative voices drift toward unsupported claims about lost advanced civilizations or forgotten global catastrophes. Though mainstream archaeology finds little evidence for such conclusions, the reality may be stranger precisely because it is human. Because what rises from this hill is not evidence of superhuman knowledge. It is evidence that humans become far more socially and symbolically complex much earlier than once believed. As excavation continues, another unsettling realization emerges. Only a small fraction of Gobekli Tepe has actually been uncovered. Much of the hill remains buried. Ground-penetrating surveys suggest additional structures still lie hidden beneath the earth. waiting in darkness beneath layers intentionally placed there thousands of years ago, not destroyed, buried on purpose. And that may be the strangest part of all. The people who build these enormous circles eventually fill them with debris, stone, tools, animal bone, and dirt, carefully sealing the structures beneath the hill itself. The sanctuary disappears long before written history begins, generations pass. Kingdoms rise and collapse elsewhere. Empires spread across the Near East. Languages evolve and vanish. The buried pillars sleep underground while Egypt has not yet even imagined its first pharaoh. Then, after 12 millennia, the hill opens again, and the deeper humanity looks into it, the less certain the old story becomes. Long before the stones are raised, the world around Gobekli Tepe belongs to ice, grass, hunger, and memory. Not ice in the way the polar north knows it, not a white silence covering every hill, but ice as a force shaping the entire planet from a distance. Glaciers lock away water, seas fall, winds carry dust across open lands, forests shrink and return in restless pulses, animals move through corridors that no longer exist, human groups follow them, not blindly, but with a knowledge built from generations of watching tracks, clouds, seeds, floods, and stars. In this world, there is no Egypt, there is no Mesopotamia, there are no palaces beside the Nile, no scribes pressing signs into clay, no armies moving under banners, no royal tombs, no tax collectors, no city walls catching the sunrise. The people who live across the hills and plains of the northern Fertile Crescent inhabit a landscape where survival depends on movement and attention. They know where wild grains ripen first. They know when gazelle herds gather. They know which valleys hold water after dry months. They know stone, wood, bone, sinew, and fire with an intimacy later civilizations often lose. The old habit is to imagine these people as living at the edge of possibility, waiting for agriculture to rescue them from uncertainty. But the evidence remains incomplete, and what survives in the record suggests something far more interesting. Late Ice Age hunter-gatherers are not simply poor farmers who have not yet discovered farming. They are specialists in a different way of life. Their world is mobile, but not chaotic. Their territories may be wide, but they are not empty. Certain springs, ridges, caves, hunting grounds, and gathering places return again and again in seasonal cycles, becoming anchors in memory long before they become permanent villages. Across Southwest Asia, this long transition leaves scattered clues. Stone tools change shape, burials become more elaborate, shell beads travel far from the sea, obsidian moves across distances that imply contact between groups. People begin returning to favoured places with enough regularity that those places accumulate debris, memory, and meaning. They are not yet cities, but neither are they random camps. They are nodes in a human landscape that is slowly becoming more connected, more symbolic and more demanding. Near the end of the Ice Age, some communities in the Levant, often associated with the Natufian culture, build semi-permanent settlements, harvest wild cereals, bury their dead beneath house floors, and create rich symbolic objects. They do not yet live as later farmers do, but they show that the boundary between hunter-gatherer and farmer is not a clean line. It is a wide zone of experiment. People try new combinations of mobility and stability. They gather more intensely. They store food. They return to the same places. They create rituals around the dead and the living. The transformation is not sudden. It is slow, uneven, and probably felt by no one as the beginning of civilization. Gobekli Tepe races from this wider world of experiment. The people who gather there likely understand abundance and scarcity as alternating conditions, not opposites. In good seasons, the hills around them may offer wild einkorn wheat, pistachio, almond, fruit, tubers, and game. Gazelles move in great numbers across the plains. Wild cattle and onagers roam nearby. Birds fill wetlands and seasonal pools. In difficult years, the same landscape tightens, water retreats, herds shift routes, plants fail in places where they once flourished. A group that survives here must be flexible, observant, and socially connected enough to endure sudden change. That matters because monuments do not rise from empty stomachs alone. They require moments when labour can be gathered, when people can leave ordinary subsistence tasks long enough to carve, haul, and raise stone. They also require a reason strong enough to persuade people to do work that does not immediately feed them. A pillar does not chase gazelle. A carved fox does not fill a basket with grain. Yet someone decides these stones matter enough to shape the hill itself. The builders inherit a world crowded with animals, and not merely as food. Wild creatures dominate the symbolic imagination of Gobekli Tepe. The carvings that later emerge from the buried pillars are not scenes of fields and herds under human control. They are images of untamed life snakes sliding across stone, boars bristling with danger, foxes alert and narrow-faced, birds with long legs, scorpions, spiders, aurochs, and predators. This is not yet the art of domestication. It is the art of a world where humans live among powers they do not fully command. One lesser known and striking detail is that many of the animal bones found at Gobekli Tepe come from wild species rather than domestic livestock. The meals eaten there, at least in the earlier phases, appear tied to hunting rather than herding. The evidence suggests large-scale consumption, possibly feasting, but not the tidy economy of a farming village with sheep pens and grain stores neatly arranged beside houses. Scholars still debate how often people gathered at the site and from how far away, but the bones hint at gatherings that are temporary, intense, and socially important. The landscape itself may help explain why such gatherings become possible. The region around Gobekli Tepe lies near what some researchers call a zone of early domestication, where wild ancestors of important crops grow naturally. This does not mean farming appears instantly because people notice wheat. Humans know plants for tens of thousands of years before agriculture. The shift requires pressure, opportunity, habit, climate, and social change. But the ingredients are present. Wild cereals are there, skilled gatherers are there, seasonal congregation points are there. A changing climate keeps disturbing old patterns. The conditions are not a simple cause, but they form a stage on which something unusual can happen. And there is another force, harder to excavate but impossible to ignore: imagination. Human beings are not moved by calories alone. They carry stories in landscapes. A spring can become ancestral. A ridge can become dangerous. A species can become a sign. A burial place can bind the living to the dead. A hill can become the center of a world without being a city. At Gobekli Tepe, the future sanctuary may begin as one of these meaningful places before the first pillar is raised. Perhaps people gather there because it is visible from far away. Perhaps because it overlooks hunting routes. Perhaps because older traditions already mark it as powerful. The evidence cannot tell us exactly what they believe. It can only show that belief, memory, and labour converge there with unusual force. So before Gobekli Tepe becomes a mystery of stone, it is a mystery of people standing at the edge of a changing world. They are not yet farmers in the later sense. They are not citizens. They are not subjects. They're communities with deep knowledge, shared rituals, and the capacity to cooperate across distances. They live in a world where the Ice Age is loosening its grip, where abundance can appear and disappear, where old movements no longer guarantee survival, and where gathering together may become as important as moving apart. Out of that world, the hill begins to matter. The first stones do not announce themselves as a revolution. They appear as fragments, edges, hints of something shaped by hands and then swallowed by the hill. Archaeology often begins this way, not with a grand revelation, but with a wrong assumption slowly corrected by dirt. A mound is mapped, a shard is noted, a farmer remembers where the plough caught, a surveyor sees limestone that does not belong in the pattern of ordinary geology. The past rarely rises all at once, it leaks upward. At Gobekli Tepe, that leakage begins long before the site becomes famous. In the 1960s, a joint survey by Turkish and American researchers records the hill, notices flint tools and stone remains, and interprets the location as something much later and less extraordinary. The standing stones, partly visible in the ground, are thought to belong to a Byzantine or medieval cemetery. It is an understandable mistake. The region is layered with human occupation from many periods, and no one expects a place of such antiquity to contain monumental architecture. Expectation becomes a kind of blindness. The hill keeps its secret because the old timeline gives scholars no reason to look deeper. Decades later, Klaus Schmidt visits the mound and sees it differently. He's worked on early Neolithic sites nearby, and the stone fragments at Gobekli Tepe do not look medieval to him. They look older, stranger, and deliberately worked. The limestone pieces scattered across the surface resemble the tops of large T-shaped pillars. Flint tools cover the ground in quantities that suggest intensive activity. The mound itself is too regular, too full of debris, too heavily marked by human presence to dismiss. When excavation begins in the 1990s, the hill starts turning from a local curiosity into one of the most unsettling archaeological discoveries of the modern age. The process is slow. Soil is removed with careful attention. Buried walls appear, then stone settings, then the tops of enormous pillars. Soon the excavators realize the hill is not covering a single structure, but multiple monumental enclosures. The earliest and most famous are circular or oval spaces, each defined by stone walls and interrupted by T-shaped pillars set around the perimeter. At the center stand two larger pillars, facing one another like silent figures in a chamber made for an audience that vanished before history learned to write. These central pillars are not small. Some reach more than 5 meters in height and may weigh many tons. Their surfaces are carved in relief with animals, symbols, and human-like details. Arms descend along their sides, hands rest near the front, belts and hanging garments appear on some of them, yet the upper crossbar of each T remains blank, faceless, almost abstract. If they represent beings, they are beings without eyes or mouths. If they represent ancestors, spirits, or powerful presences, the evidence does not allow certainty. Scholars still debate whether these forms are stylized humans, supernatural figures, or something more complex within a symbolic world now almost entirely lost. The enclosures themselves receive simple labels A, B, C, D. The names are plain, almost bureaucratic, and they sit strangely beside the visual power of the place. Enclosure D, among the best preserved, contains some of the most striking carvings. Foxes move across pillars, birds stretch their necks. A scorpion appears near other symbols in a composition that has inspired many interpretations, most of them cautious, some of them wildly speculative. The stonework is not crude. The animals have tension and personality. They are not random decoration. Their placement suggests deliberate choices, though the grammar of those choices remains unknown. Nearby, quarry areas reveal another layer of the story. The builders cut pillars from the local limestone bedrock. Some unfinished stones remain in place, still attached to the earth, as if work stopped before they could be freed. These unfinished pillars are invaluable, because they show part of the construction process frozen in time. Workers selected sections of bedrock, shaped the outline, carved channels, and then separated the pillar before transport. No bronze chisels assist them. No iron tools bite into the stone. This is a world of flint, stone hammers, wood, leverage, rope, and coordinated effort. The engineering is not impossible, but it is demanding. That distinction matters. Gobekli Tepe does not require lost technology. It requires people with skill, patience, organization, and a shared reason to do difficult things. Moving a multi-ton pillar even a short distance across uneven ground means planning the route, preparing the surface, coordinating labor, and accepting risk. A pillar that breaks at the wrong moment wastes weeks or months of work. A group that can repeatedly raise such stones is a group capable of sustained cooperation. One surprising detail is that Gobekli Tepe is not a single clean phase of construction. It changes over time. The earliest monumental circular enclosures eventually give way to smaller, more rectangular structures. The site is rebuilt, modified, filled, and reused across centuries. This makes it harder to interpret because the hill is not one moment. It is a long sequence of activity, memory, and alteration. What a carving means in one phase may not mean the same thing centuries later. What begins as a dramatic ritual enclosure may eventually become part of a transformed landscape of smaller buildings and changing practices. The excavated spaces are also packed with debris. This is not simply wind-blown sediment. The fill contains limestone rubble, flint tools, animal bones, and other materials. The backfill is dense and deliberate enough to suggest that people intentionally buried the enclosures. In archaeology, deliberate burial can be as meaningful as construction. It may mark closure, renewal, protection, abandonment, or transformation. But no single explanation fully accounts for this. Why bury a place that required so much labor to build? Why seal it rather than let it decay? Why preserve it under tons of material and then move on? As more of the site is mapped, another strange fact becomes clear. The visible excavation covers only part of the mound. Geophysical surveys suggest many additional structures remain underground. The famous circles are not isolated marvels but glimpses into a much larger complex. That buried majority gives Gobekli Tepe an unusual power. It is both revealed and hidden at the same time. Every answer stands beside the possibility that the next enclosure could change the interpretation again. The discovery also carries an emotional force that can be easy to miss in technical descriptions. Imagine standing in a trench where the wall of the present has been cut open, looking down at a carved animal last seen by people who lived before farming villages fully spread across the region. The stone does not merely show age, it shows intention. Someone shaped the curve of a fox's back. Someone chose where the snake should coil. Someone stood before the finished pillar and recognized something in it that mattered deeply. Modern excavation turns that ancient intention into evidence, but it cannot fully translate it. Archaeologists can measure, date, compare, classify, and reconstruct. They can identify wild species, stone sources, tool marks, building phases, and patterns of deposition. They can separate supported conclusions from unsupported fantasy. but the inner world of the builders remains partly unreachable. The evidence remains incomplete, not because the work has failed, but because 12,000 years have passed between the hands that carved the stone and the hands that brushed dirt from it. So the hill becomes a paradox. It is one of the clearest signs that early humans could organize monumental labor before cities, yet its purpose remains shadowed. It is built from stone, bone, and debris, but it points toward belief, memory, fear, identity, and gathering. It looks like a sanctuary, but not one belonging to any known religion. It feels like architecture, but not urban architecture in the usual sense. It is a place where discovery does not close the mystery, it sharpens it. By the time the pillars stand exposed again beneath the Anatolian sky, the old mound is no longer just Potbelly Hill. It has become a doorway into a stage of human history that was supposed to be quiet, simple, and small. Instead, beneath the dust, it is crowded with symbols, animals, labor, and stone figures without faces. The age of Gobekli Tepe is the fact that turns curiosity into disturbance. A carved stone circle in itself is remarkable, but ancient landscapes are full of temples, tombs, shrines, and abandoned sanctuaries. Human beings have always marked important places. The shock comes when the dates settle into place and the hill refuses to fit where it is supposed to fit. The earliest monumental enclosures belong roughly to the 10th millennium BCE, around 12,000 years ago. That places them deep in the pre-pottery Neolithic, at the edge of the long transformation from mobile hunter-gatherer life towards settled farming communities. To feel how strange that is, the mind has to move backward carefully. The Great Pyramid of Giza is built around the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. Stonehenge rises in stages thousands of years after Gobekli Tepe begins. The first cities of southern Mesopotamia, places like Uruk, grow long after these pillars are already buried. Writing has not yet appeared. The first pharaohs are unimaginably far in the future. Even pottery, one of the most basic markers of later village life, is absent from the earliest phases. Gobekli Tepe does not merely predate famous monuments. It predates the social world that scholars once thought necessary to create monuments at all. Radiocarbon dating helps anchor this unsettling chronology. Organic remains from the fill and associated contexts place major activity at the site in the early Neolithic, with some of the oldest monumental phases commonly dated to around 9600 BCE, or slightly after. Dating such a complex site is not always simple. Materials in backfill can be older or younger than the structures they cover, and archaeologists must interpret each sample carefully. The evidence remains incomplete, and precise construction sequences continue to be refined. Still, the broad conclusion is firm. Gobekli Tepe is vastly older than Egypt's pyramids, and belongs to a world before fully developed agriculture. That changes the emotional scale of the discovery. The site is not a strange temple from an unknown kingdom. There is no kingdom. It is not the ceremonial center of an early city. There is no city in the usual sense. It is not the work of priests supported by a state bureaucracy. There is no state. The builders stand on the far side of all these institutions, yet they create architecture that requires coordination beyond ordinary daily survival. The old sequence begins to look too neat. Maybe farming does not simply produce religion and monumentality. Maybe ritual gathering helps create the conditions that make farming more attractive, more necessary, or more socially binding. That possibility does not mean religion invents agriculture in a simple one-way chain. Human history rarely works that cleanly. Climate, wild plant abundance, demographic pressure, seasonal movement, social alliances, risk management, and symbolic life all overlap. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but Gobekli Tepe makes it harder to imagine early agriculture as merely a practical adjustment, as if people calmly decide one day that planting seeds is more efficient than gathering them. Farming is laborious. It ties people to land. It can narrow diets and create new vulnerabilities. Something has to make that bargain worthwhile, or at least unavoidable. Large gatherings may be one part of the answer. If groups travel to a hill for ceremonies, feasts, exchanges, marriages, initiations, or ancestral rites, they need food on a scale larger than one family's daily needs. Wild gazelle can be hunted in numbers. Wild grains can be harvested and processed. But repeated gatherings create pressure. The same place must feed many people again and again. Over time, managing useful plants near gathering sites may become less accidental and more deliberate. What begins as ritual concentration could help push communities toward cultivation. Scholars still debate how strongly this model applies to Gobekli Tepe, but the site keeps the question alive. The absence of early domestic architecture at the most famous enclosures once made the puzzle sharper. If there are no ordinary houses, then what kind of place is this a shrine without a city, a pilgrimage centre before villages, a regional meeting ground for groups spread across the landscape? Later research complicates the picture, because the broader area and later levels include more evidence of settlement-like activity than the earliest interpretations emphasized. The site is not frozen as a pure temple in isolation. It changes. People may have lived nearby or used the place in ways that blur the line between ritual and daily life. But even with those refinements, the monumental early enclosures remain extraordinary. The dating also forces a reconsideration of capability. It is tempting to treat age as a measure of simplicity, as though older automatically means less organized, less imaginative, less socially complex. Gobekli Tepe stands against that habit. Its builders do not have writing, but they have memory. They do not have metal tools, but they understand stone. They do not have cities, but they coordinate people. They do not leave royal inscriptions, but they cover pillars with a symbolic world dense enough that modern scholars still struggle to interpret it. A lesser-known detail deepens this point. The site contains huge quantities of worked flint, including tools used for cutting, scraping, drilling, and shaping. These are not random leftovers from a few passing camps. They suggest repeated intensive activity by skilled hands. Flint is one of the great materials of prehistory, capable of producing edges sharper than many people expect. To later eyes, stone tools can seem crude simply because they are old. In the hands of experts, they are precise instruments. The builders of Gobekli Tepe are not improvising in ignorance. They are working within a mature technological tradition. The age of the site also places it near one of the most dramatic climatic thresholds in recent geological history, the transition out of the Younger Dryas, a sudden cold interval that interrupts the warming after the last ice age. This does not mean Gobekli Tepe is proof of any single catastrophe story. Popular theories often leap too quickly from ancient dates to cosmic disasters or lost civilizations, and much of that remains disputed or unsupported. But climate instability is real, and the timing matters. The people of the region live through environmental change that affect plants, animals, water, and mobility. Their world is not static. The hill rises during a period when adaptation is not optional. Understanding this makes the site feel less like an impossible anomaly and more like an extreme expression of a wider transformation. Across the Near East, people are experimenting with new settlement patterns, food strategies, and symbolic practices. Gobekli Tepe is exceptional in scale and preservation, but it is not evidence that history jumps from darkness into brilliance overnight. It is evidence that the roots of civilization run deeper and more tangled than the old model allowed. Monumental architecture, ritual intensity, and social gathering may belong not at the end of the agricultural revolution, but near its beginning. And still, the dates remain almost disorienting. When the first great pillars stand, Egypt is not a kingdom waiting in the wings. It is a distant landscape occupied by prehistoric peoples along the Nile, thousands of years away from pharaohs. Mesopotamia is not yet a land of cities and cuneiform tablets. The world's later centers of power are still in embryo. If that, Gobekli Tepe belongs to a time so early that the familiar landmarks of history have not yet appeared. Yet the human mind is already building in stone on a monumental scale. That is why the discovery feels less like adding an older site to the map and more like moving the horizon itself. It suggests that the human past contains complex social worlds that left no writing, no kings, no empires, and almost no names, yet still reshaped the future. The people of Gobekli Tepe do not know they are older than Egypt, because Egypt as history does not yet exist. They do not know they are challenging modern theories, because those theories are 12,000 years away. They carve, gather, hunt, feast, remember, and bury their stones. And in doing so, they leave behind a question that waits longer than any civilization that comes after them. The people who build Gobekli Tepe do not step onto the hill as a nameless mass of primitive labourers. They arrive with histories, families, obligations, rivalries, memories, and skills. Their names are gone, their languages are gone, and the stories they tell around fires are gone. But the stones preserve one essential fact with unusual force, whoever they are. They are capable of organizing life around meanings powerful enough to move mountains in pieces. The phrase hunter-gatherer can make them sound simple, almost generic. It describes how people obtain food, not the full shape of their society. A hunter-gatherer group can be highly mobile or seasonally settled, egalitarian or status-conscious, isolated or deeply connected, materially sparse or symbolically rich. The builders of Gobekli Tepe likely belong to communities living across the upper reaches of the Fertile Crescent, at a time when old categories begin to blur. They hunt wild animals, gather wild plants, work stone, process food, exchange materials, bury their dead, and return to meaningful places. They may not yet be farmers in the later village sense, but they are not wandering randomly through an empty wilderness. Their world is practical at every level. A person growing up in this landscape must learn the timing of ripening grasses, the habits of wild sheep and gazelle, the dangers of snakes and boars, the quality of different flint sources, the signs of weather, the locations of water, and the social rules that determine who shares food with whom. Knowledge is not stored in books. It is carried in bodies, roots, songs, gestures, and repeated tasks. A child learns by watching hands split stone, strip sinew, clean hides, roast meat, grind seeds, and read tracks in dust. Memory is communal because survival depends on remembering together. The archaeological record cannot show all of this directly, but it gives hints. The flint tools found at and around Gobekli Tepe suggest skilled production. Animal bones reveal hunting and butchering on a large scale. Stone vessels and grinding equipment point toward food preparation. The carving show trained eyes and practiced hands. These people understand proportion, relief, surface, and symbolic placement. They are not simply stacking rocks, they are creating a visual language in stone, even if its grammar has not survived. One lesser-known detail is that the human-like pillars themselves may preserve clues about bodies, clothing, and identity. On some pillars, carved arms bend downward along the sides, with hands meeting near the front, belts, buckles, and what look like loin-cloths appear in relief. These details are easy to miss beside the more dramatic animals, but they matter because they suggest that the T-shaped forms are not merely abstract supports. They may represent stylized persons or beings imagined in human-like form, yet they remain faceless. Their anonymity may be deliberate. A face individualizes. These pillars seem to do something else. They present presence without personality. Scholars still debate what kind of beings the pillars represent. They may be ancestors, spirits, mythic figures, ritual participants, or symbolic embodiments of social groups. The evidence remains incomplete, and no interpretation can be treated as final. But their scale suggests importance. The central paired pillars dominate the enclosures, while smaller pillars ring the walls. The arrangement has the feel of hierarchy, though not necessarily political hierarchy in the later sense. It may be cosmological, ritual, ancestral, or social. The stones tell us that some figures matter more than others, but not exactly why. To build them, people must come together in numbers. This does not require a state, but it does require cooperation beyond the household. A group has to quarry the stone, shape it, transport it, raise it, decorate it, and maintain the space around it. Some individuals may specialize in carving, others may organize food, others may lead rituals or preserve knowledge about the correct arrangement of symbols. The labor itself becomes a form of social glue. People who work together on a monument also create shared memory. They can point to a pillar and remember the season it was raised, the hunt that fed the workers, the deaths that followed, the alliances formed, the obligations created. This is where Gobekli Tepe becomes so important for understanding early society. It shows complexity without the usual signs of kingship. There are no royal tombs proclaiming one ruler above all others, no written decrees, no palaces, no administrative tablets. Yet the site implies leadership of some kind, even if temporary ritual or situational. Someone knows where the pillar should stand. Someone convinces others to help. Someone understands the design well enough to repeat it. The organization may come from respected elders, ritual specialists, skilled builders, or networks of kin groups. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but the need for coordination is unavoidable. The builders also live in a world where human identity is probably not sharply separated from animals, landscapes, and the dead in the way modern categories often assume. The animal carvings do not look like casual decoration. They may mark clans, dangers, stories, seasons, spirits, prey species, or beings encountered in altered states of ritual imagination. Popular interpretations sometimes rush toward astrology or secret codes, but those claims often exceed the evidence. What can be said more carefully is that animals dominate the symbolic field. Human figures, where present, are strange, partial, or faceless. The wild world surrounds the human world at every turn. Food remains central. The bones found at the site include gazelle and other wild animals, suggesting that large hunts may support gatherings. Processing wild grain may also play a role. A place like Gobekli Tepe could not function only as architecture. People who travel there must eat. They must sleep somewhere. They must settle disputes, exchange information, arrange partnerships, and perhaps mourn or initiate members of the group. The monument is the visible stone centre of a wider social event that leaves less obvious traces. The question of where these people live is complicated. Early interpretations emphasize the absence of domestic houses at Gobekli Tepe and treated it mainly as a special-purpose ritual centre. Later work in the broader region and at the site itself has made the picture less simple. Nearby and related sites show that people are becoming more settled, and Gobekli Tepe may include areas of repeated habitation or daily activity in addition to monumental spaces. The old phrase "temple before city" is powerful, but scholars now approach it with more caution. The site may not be a city, but neither is it necessarily isolated from ordinary life. That ambiguity makes it more human. Sacred and practical life may not be separate categories here. A feast can be religious and political at the same time. A hunt can feed bodies and create prestige. A carving can be art, memory, warning, and myth. A building can host rituals while also structuring alliances between groups. Modern people often divide life into economy, religion, politics, and art. The builders of Gobekli Tepe may not have experienced those divisions as separate at all. There is also the matter of risk. Monument building in a world of shifting climate and wild food resources is not obviously safe. Labour spent on stone is labour not spent gathering, hunting, or moving camp. But social investment can be survival investment. Alliances formed at gathering places may matter when drought comes. Shared rituals may reduce conflict between groups. Feasts may redistribute food. Marriage networks may widen support. A monumental sanctuary can bind scattered people into a larger community of obligation. What looks impractical may be one of the ways humans manage uncertainty. So who builds Gobekli Tepe? Not a lost empire, not aliens, not refugees from a vanished advanced civilization. The evidence does not support those stories. The builders are prehistoric people of the early Neolithic, living in a changing landscape, using stone tools and deep knowledge, capable of immense symbolic and cooperative achievement. They are unfamiliar not because they are less human, but because they are human in a world before the institutions that usually make ancient people legible to us. They leave no names, but they leave choices. They choose the hill, they choose limestone, they choose animal forms, they choose faceless pillars, they choose to gather, carve, raise, feast, and eventually bury. Those choices are enough to show that long before Egypt, long before kings, long before writing fixes memory into signs, human beings are already building places where the visible and invisible worlds meet. The central puzzle of Gobekli Tepe is not simply that people built in stone. Human beings have always altered landscapes when something mattered enough. The puzzle is that they appear to do it before the usual foundations of settled civilization are fully in place. The hill seems to hold a sanctuary without a city, a ceremonial centre without streets, a gathering place without the familiar machinery of kings, priests, granaries, and bureaucrats. It is a place that looks monumental before the world around it looks urban. That is what gives the old phrase such power, temple before city. It is not perfect, and scholars now use it with more caution than they once did, but it captures the shock of the discovery. For a long time, the expected order runs in the other direction. First people settle, then they farm, then they store food, create surplus, build hierarchy, support specialists, and eventually construct temples. Sacred architecture is supposed to be an outcome of settled complexity. Gobekli Tepe raises the possibility that sacred gathering may have helped create settled complexity in the first place. The earliest monumental enclosures do not look like normal houses. They're too large, too symbolically charged, and too carefully arranged around central pillars. Their interiors seem designed for presence, performance, and movement rather than domestic routine. The walls curve around the space, carrying smaller pillars like participants around the dominant central pair. The carvings are not placed randomly. Animals appear on selected surfaces. Some pillars seem to face inward. The architecture creates an enclosed world, a controlled setting where stone beings, wild creatures, and human gatherings meet. Still, calling it a temple can be misleading if the word brings to mind later buildings with priesthoods, offerings, written liturgies, and formal gods. Gobekli Tepe belongs to a time before those categories are visible. There is no inscription naming a deity. No altar clearly explains the rituals. No statue with a known identity stands at the centre. The evidence remains incomplete, and what survives in the record suggests ritual importance without telling us the ritual's name. It may be a sanctuary, but not necessarily a temple in the later institutional sense. The absence of a conventional city makes every interpretation more difficult. A city leaves a broad signature dense housing, streets, storage facilities, workshops, waste systems, administrative tools, social stratification, and often cemeteries or public buildings arranged in relation to neighbourhoods. Gobekli Tepe does not provide that picture, especially in its earliest and most famous phases. The monumental structures dominate the evidence. Domestic traces are harder to identify, more debated, and more uneven. This does not mean nobody ever stayed there, only that the site does not behave like a normal early town. That distinction matters because it keeps Gobekli Tepe suspended between categories. It is not a city, but it is more than a camp. It is not a village in the usual sense, but it is not an isolated sculpture garden. It is not a palace, not a tomb complex, not a fortress, not an ordinary shrine attached to a settlement. The site sits at the edge of definitions created from later periods, and those definitions begin to fail under the weight of the stones. One possibility is that Gobekli Tepe functions as a regional gathering centre. Groups from surrounding areas may come together seasonally for ceremonies, feasting, exchange, alliance building, and perhaps rites linked to the dead. Such gatherings can be socially powerful even without permanent urban occupation. They create relationships larger than the small band. They allow goods, partners, stories, and obligations to circulate. They can resolve conflict, display generosity, mark identity, and renew shared myths. In a world without written contracts or police forces, repeated gatherings at meaningful places may help hold society together. The architecture supports this idea in subtle ways. Enclosures are not simply practical spaces. They are built to impress, focus attention, and separate inside from outside. Entering one may have changed how people experience the hill. The walls close around the visitor. The central pillars rise above human height. Carved animals seem to watch, threaten, or move through the stone. The space gathers people not only physically but emotionally. It turns a hillside into a charged interior, a place where ordinary life may be suspended. A lesser-known detail is that the floor surfaces in some enclosures appear carefully prepared, sometimes with smoothed or terrazzo-like finishes made from lime-rich materials. Such floors require effort and maintenance. They suggest that the interiors are not casual open areas but intentionally finished spaces. People are not merely placing pillars in rough ground. They're constructing environments meant to be used, seen, and perhaps ritually cleaned or renewed. This kind of attention strengthens the sense that the enclosures are special places, whatever exact ceremonies they host. Another possibility is that Gobekli Tepe helps organize labor and identity between groups. Monumental construction does not only reflect social bonds, it creates them. People who quarry and move a pillar together become part of its story. The difficulty of the task may be part of the point. Shared hardship transforms stone into memory. A group can measure itself by what it has raised. Neighbouring groups may compete to sponsor enclosures, carvings, feasts, or ceremonies. Prestige can grow from generosity and labour before it hardens into formal inequality. Scholars still debate whether Gobekli Tepe shows early social hierarchy. This site implies leadership, but leadership need not mean kingship. Some people may have ritual authority. Some may possess specialised knowledge of carving, myth, or seasonal timing. Some may coordinate work because of age, reputation, or lineage. The central pillars may encode status among supernatural beings, ancestors, or social groups, but without burials rich in grave goods, written titles, or palatial residences, it is difficult to prove a ruling class. The evidence points to coordination and difference, not yet to a state. This is why the sanctuary without city problem is so important. It forces a new respect for the social possibilities of non-state societies. Large-scale cooperation does not require taxes if participation brings spiritual, social, or practical reward. It does not require armies if shared belief and obligation are strong enough. It does not require writing if memory is carried through repeated performance. The builders of Gobekli Tepe may be living proof that human societies can create complexity in forms that leave few of the markers archaeologists are trained to expect. Yet there is also caution. The romantic image of peaceful hunter-gatherers gathering in pure spiritual harmony is no more secure than the old image of primitive wandering. The animal imagery includes dangerous creatures. Human remains from nearby early Neolithic contexts sometimes show complex treatment after death, including skull removal and modification. Across the wider region, the transition towards settlement brings new tensions: territoriality, disease, inequality, pressure on resources, and violence in some places. Gobekli Tepe may be beautiful, but beauty does not mean serenity. Ritual can bind communities, but it can also mark fear, exclusion, sacrifice, competition, or anxiety. The hill may therefore represent a world under pressure as much as a world of inspiration. Climate shifts, growing populations, more predictable gathering places, and intensifying use of wild grains could all make social coordination more necessary. When people see each other more often and depend on shared landscapes more heavily, they need stronger systems of meaning. Monuments help create permanence when life itself is changing. Stone stands still while seasons become unpredictable. Pillars outlast the bodies that raise them. In a time of transition, that permanence may have felt powerful. The strangest part is that Gobekli Tepe does not clearly point forward to cities in a straight line. It is older than cities, but it is not simply a city waiting to happen. It belongs to its own world. Later urban temples in Mesopotamia will be embedded in economies of grain, labour, kingship, and writing. Gobekli Tepe's enclosures are embedded in wild animals, stone tools, feasts, seasonal gatherings, and emerging settlement. It is not a primitive version of later religion. It is something earlier and different, a form of collective life that later civilizations may obscure rather than explain. What survives in the record suggests that the hill acts as a centre before there is a city to centre. People come to it, work there, eat there, carve there, remember there, and perhaps define themselves through it. The stones create a kind of social gravity. They draw bodies across the landscape and hold stories in place, around them. People who are not yet citizens begin behaving in ways that foreshadow civilization without fully becoming it. That is why Gobekli Tepe remains so difficult to name. The familiar words are all slightly wrong. Temple is too late, city is too large, camp is too small, shrine is too modest, monument is too cold. It is a place where people gather before the world has invented the institutions that would later explain such gathering. It stands at the threshold, not only between hunting and farming, but between ways of being human that modern history has trouble seeing. And perhaps that is the real strangeness. The hill does not show civilization appearing fully formed. It shows something more mysterious, people creating a center before they create a city, raising stone before they raise walls around daily life, giving shape to an invisible order before that order becomes government, economy, or empire. The animals come out of the stone as if they have been waiting there longer than civilization itself. They do not stand politely at the edges of the story. They crowd it. Foxes stretch across the pillars with lean bodies and pointed faces. Snakes slide in curling lines. Boars appear heavy and dangerous. Birds lift long necks or fold themselves into strange positions. A scorpion waits with its curved tail. Aurochs, gazelles, cranes, insects, and other creatures move through the carved surfaces, not as background decoration, but as the living vocabulary of the place. At first glance, the animals seem to offer a way in. They are recognizable. They give the modern eye something to hold on to. A snake is still a snake. A fox is still a fox. A boar still carries the same compact menace it carries today. Yet the longer one looks, the less simple they become. These are not random wildlife sketches. Their placement, repetition, and relationship to the pillars suggest a symbolic system. The problem is that the system has lost its key. There is no inscription beside the scorpion explaining what it means. No myth survives to identify the fox. No priestly manual tells us how the snake should be read. The safest beginning is the obvious one. These are wild animals, and wild animals dominate the world of the builders. The earliest faces of Gobekli Tepe belong to a time before domestic herds and planted fields fully define life. The creatures carved into the pillars are not sheep in pens or cattle under human ownership. They are animals of open landscapes, thickets, rocky slopes, wetlands, and danger. They are hunted, feared, watched, avoided, admired, and perhaps imagined as powers with agency of their own. In this sense, the carvings belong to a world where humans are not yet the masters of the countryside. They are participants in it. That alone gives the site a different atmosphere from later agricultural temples. Later civilizations often fill sacred art with domesticated abundance grain, cattle, ploughed fields, divine kings, orderly processions. Gobekli Tepe presents something wilder. Its animals are not calm servants of human prosperity. Many seem alert, predatory, venomous, or difficult to control. Snakes and scorpions do not feed a community in any ordinary sense. Foxes are not staple prey. Boars can kill. Aurochs, the wild ancestors of domestic cattle, are powerful and dangerous. The symbolic world of the hill is not a peaceful farmyard. It is a landscape of forces. A lesser-known detail is that some animals at Gobekli Tepe appear in combinations that resist easy interpretation. On certain pillars, creatures are stacked, paired, or positioned near abstract signs. The famous pillar, sometimes called Pillar 43, includes a scorpion, birds, and other symbols arranged in a composition that has inspired intense debate. Popular accounts have tried to read it as an astronomical chart, a comet record, or a coded warning from deep time. Such claims attract attention, but they remain disputed and often go far beyond what the evidence can securely support. What can be said is more modest and more interesting. The carving is deliberate, complex, and meaningful within a symbolic tradition we do not yet understand. The temptation to decode is powerful. Modern people are trained to think symbols must have fixed meanings. A bird means the sky, a snake means death or rebirth, a scorpion means danger, a fox means cleverness. But those meanings come from later cultures, not automatically from the minds of people 12,000 years ago. In some societies, an animal may represent a clan, in others, a season, a mythic ancestor, a ritual role, a shamanic helper, a taboo, a hunting memory, a direction, a disease, a warning, or a being encountered in dreams. The evidence remains incomplete, and every confident translation risks making the ancient world too familiar. Even so, patterns matter. Foxes appear prominently at Gobekli Tepe and at related early Neolithic sites in the region. Their importance may reflect more than ecological familiarity. Foxes are small predators, adaptable, elusive, often active at twilight, moving between open ground and hidden dens. To many human societies, animals that cross boundaries become symbolically charged. They belong neither fully to daylight nor darkness, neither to the camp nor the wild. Whether the builders of Gobekli Tepe thought this way cannot be proven, but the repeated attention given to foxes suggests they carried meaning beyond simple observation. Snakes are even more striking. They appear frequently, sometimes in dense groups, sometimes flowing across stone like living lines. A snake is both animal and motion, body and sign. It emerges from holes, sheds skin, disappears under earth, appears without warning, and can kill with a bite. For people living close to the ground, sleeping near stones, gathering plants, and moving through brush, snakes are not abstract symbols, they are real presences. If later cultures associate snakes with death, renewal, danger, and the underworld, those associations are not evidence for Gobekli Tepe, but they remind us that the animal's physical nature easily invites symbolic weight. Birds add another layer. Some long-legged birds may be cranes or similar species, and their poses can seem almost human. In some cases, birds appear near headless human imagery at other early Neolithic sites, and across the broader region there is evidence of special treatment of skulls and bodies. This has led some scholars to consider whether certain bird images may connect with death rituals, exposure, transformation, or the journey of the dead. The idea remains debated, but it is not fanciful to suspect that birds, especially scavenging or high-flying birds, could occupy a special place in a worldview concerned with bodies, ancestors, and the boundary between earth and sky. The carvings also remind us how much of the builder's mental world is missing. If they painted wood, shaped fibre, wore masks, sang, danced, carried decorated skins, or created temporary images in sand and earth, most of that is gone. Stone survives disproportionately. Gobekli Tepe may preserve only the hardest fraction of a much richer ritual environment. The animals carved into pillars may have been joined by perishable costumes, painted bodies, sound, smoke, food, and movement. A modern visitor sees silent stone. The original experience may have been crowded, noisy, and physically intense. The animal's relationship to the human-like pillars is especially unsettling. If the T-shaped stones represent powerful beings, then the animals surround or attach to those beings. Some creatures appear on the sides or fronts of pillars, almost as if they are moving across bodies. In later art, animals can mark identity, power, danger, protection, or mythic association. At Gobekli Tepe, the effect is ambiguous. The faceless pillars stand upright and still, while animals move across them. The human form is silent. The animal world is active. It is as if humanity has not yet placed itself at the center of creation. That may be one of the deepest clues the site offers. The builders live just before or during the early stages of a transformation that will eventually make humans dominant managers of plants, animals, and landscapes. Agriculture will reorder relationships between species. Domestication will bring animals into human-controlled reproduction and labor. Fields will replace wild stands. Villages will harden the boundary between inside and outside. But at Gobekli Tepe, the old wild order remains immense. The carvings preserve a world still filled with beings that are not under human control. No single explanation fully accounts for the animal imagery. The carvings may combine myth, social identity, ritual fear, ecological memory, and ceremonial performance. Some may refer to stories now lost. Some may identify groups who gathered at the site. Some may mark dangers encountered in the surrounding landscape. Some may belong to a cosmology where animals mediate between the living, the dead, and forces beyond ordinary sight. The uncertainty is not a weakness of the evidence. It is part of the evidence. It shows how much symbolic life existed before writing, and how little of it can be translated once speech disappears. Yet the animals still do something across the distance. They prevent the builders from becoming abstract. They remind us that these people inhabit a vivid world of eyes, claws, horns, wings, and scales. They know the smell of wild boar. They hear cranes calling over wetlands. They watch foxes slip between rocks. They see snakes vanish into cracks in the earth. They fear, hunt, imitate, remember, and carve. The stone animals are not simply pictures of nature. They are traces of relationships. And in those relationships, the strangeness of Gobekli Tepe grows deeper. A place older than Egypt was found, but it was not filled with the symbols later civilization would teach us to expect. No kings gaze from the walls. No gods sit enthroned with crowns and staffs. No written prayers explain the ceremony. Instead, the oldest monumental sanctuary yet known is alive with wild creatures, as though the first great stone architecture did not begin with human triumph, but with humans standing among animals in a world still too powerful to tame. Food is where the mystery becomes practical. Stone pillars can make Gobekli Tepe feel otherworldly, but every person who gathers on that hill has a body that needs feeding. Every carving session, every ritual, every journey from nearby valleys, every night spent near the mound depends on meat, grain, water, firewood, and labor. The sanctuary may point toward invisible worlds, but it is built by people with sore hands, empty stomachs, and social obligations that must be renewed in the most human way possible by eating together. The animal bones found at Gobekli Tepe suggest that feasting may have been central to the site's life. Large quantities of wild animal remains, especially gazelle and other game, show that people are consuming meat there on a significant scale. These are not the remains of a settled village economy dominated by sheep pens and cattle stalls. In the earlier phases, the food world is still largely wild. Animals are hunted, brought in, butchered, cooked, shared, and discarded. The hill becomes not only a place of stone, but a place of smell, smoke, blood, grease, and noise. Feasting is easy to underestimate because it can sound festive and secondary, as if it were merely a celebration after the important work is done. In many societies, it is far more serious than that. A feast can create debt, it can display status, it can bring distant groups into alliance, it can settle tensions, mark rites of passage, honor the dead, negotiate marriages, or prove that a leader has the ability to gather resources. In a world without written contracts, eating together can bind people more powerfully than signatures. The shared meal becomes memory, obligation, and politics. At Gobekli Tepe, feasting may help explain how large numbers of people are mobilized. Someone has to persuade workers to quarry and move stone. Someone has to feed them while they do it. The promise of ritual importance alone may be powerful, but food gives that importance a physical form. A successful gathering shows that a group can hunt enough, gather enough, organize enough, and give enough. The ability to host may become a source of prestige long before kingship appears. One surprising detail is the evidence for large stone vessels at Gobekli Tepe, some of which may have been used in food or drink preparation. Researchers have considered whether fermented beverages, possibly made from wild grains, played a role in gatherings. The idea is plausible but debated. Alcoholic drinks can emerge before full agriculture if people collect and process wild cereals, but direct evidence is difficult to secure. Still, the possibility matters because fermentation changes the social atmosphere of a gathering. It turns grain into something more than food. It becomes ceremony, pleasure, risk, and perhaps a way of making labour feel less like labour. This does not mean beer built Gobekli Tepe, as some simplified versions of the theory suggest. No single explanation fully accounts for this place. But the broader point is important ritual gatherings create unusual demands. A small mobile group can live by moving through seasonal resources. A large gathering at a fixed place needs concentration. Meat must be hunted in quantity. Wild grains may need to be harvested, transported, ground, soaked, cooked, or fermented. Water must be available. Fuel must be collected. The larger and more repeated the gatherings become, the more attractive it may be to manage food sources deliberately. This is where Gobekli Tepe enters the story of agriculture, not as a simple cause, but as a pressure point. Farming does not appear because humans suddenly become clever. People have known plants for a very long time. They understand seeds, seasons, and growth. What changes is the relationship between people, place, and need. If communities return again and again to a ceremonial centre, if they gather in numbers, if feasts become essential to social life, then the surrounding landscape begins to matter differently. Wild stands of grain near the site become valuable. Protecting them, encouraging them, and eventually cultivating them may become part of maintaining the gatherings themselves. Scholars still debate the exact role of feasting in the origins of farming. Some argue that practical subsistence pressures matter more. Others emphasize climate change, population growth, or the advantages of storing grain. The evidence remains incomplete, and different regions likely follow different paths. But Gobekli Tepe makes one idea difficult to dismiss. The road to agriculture may run not only through hunger, but through ceremony. People may begin intensifying food production not merely to survive daily life, but to sustain larger social worlds. The wild grains of the surrounding region are important here. Southeastern Anatolia lies close to the natural range of wild einkorn wheat and other plants that later become central to Neolithic farming. These cereals do not domesticate themselves, and domestication is not immediate. Early cultivation may take centuries before plants show clear genetic and morphological changes. But the setting is suggestive. People gather in a region rich in wild cereals at the same time that social practices may require concentrated food. The stage is set for experiment. There is something almost ironic in this. Agriculture is often imagined as the great practical breakthrough that frees humans to build monuments. Gobekli Tepe hints that the desire to build monuments, hold ceremonies, and gather people may have helped push humans toward the practical discipline of farming. The symbolic may have pulled the economic behind it. The sacred may have placed demands on the stomach. The feast may have stood between the wild field and the cultivated one. Yet the transition is not necessarily an improvement in every way. Early farming can bring harder labor, more dependence on fewer foods, greater vulnerability to crop failure, closer living conditions, and new diseases. Hunter-gatherers often enjoy varied diets and flexible movement. Settled farmers may work longer hours and face new forms of inequality. The move toward agriculture is not simply progress, it is a trade. And perhaps one people do not fully understand until they are already deep inside it. At Gobekli Tepe, the evidence catches the trade before it is complete. The bones still speak of hunting, the carvings still speak of wild animals, the site still belongs to a world not yet domesticated. But the scale of gathering points toward a different future. Once people create fixed centers of ritual and memory, they begin creating reasons to stay near certain places. Once they need to feed gatherings, they begin increasing pressure on local resources. Once they invest labor in stone, they create permanence. Permanence changes everything. The feast also leaves another kind of trace discarded remains. Bones in the fill and surrounding deposits are not just garbage, they are the residue of events. Each fragment may have passed through human hands. Each cut mark or burn pattern belongs to an act of preparation and consumption. The hill's backfill, packed with debris, animal remains, flint, and stone, may preserve centuries of activity compressed into the burial of the enclosures. What looks like rubble can be memory ground down into archaeology. Imagine a gathering at the hill before the enclosures are buried. People arrive from different directions, carrying tools, hides, baskets, stories, perhaps ornaments and objects from distant places. Hunters return with gazelle, others process grain, fires burn. The stone pillars stand above the crowd, carved animals flickering in changing light. There may be chanting, dancing, initiation, mourning, teaching, negotiation, or silence. The exact rituals are gone. But the basic human intensity remains imaginable. To feed many people in such a setting is not a side activity. It is the event's foundation. What survives in the record suggests that Gobekli Tepe is not merely a place where people look at stone. It is a place where bodies gather, labor is organized, animals are consumed, and social bonds are renewed. It may be one of the clearest early examples of how belief and subsistence entangle. The builders are not choosing between ritual and survival. They're creating a world where ritual becomes part of survival. And this makes the hill stranger, not less strange. The mystery is not that people with no food security somehow wasted time on monuments. The mystery is that monuments, feasts, and food security may have grown together. The carved pillars rise from a society still rooted in wild resources, but their very existence may help push that society toward new forms of settlement and cultivation. Before fields fully tame the landscape, gatherings tame human movement. Before grain becomes the basis of cities, it may help feed ceremonies on a hill. Gobekli Tepe therefore stands at a crossroads of appetite and imagination. It shows human beings using food to make meaning, and meaning to reorganize food. The feast comes before the farm, or at least beside it. The sanctuary gathers people before the city holds them, and somewhere in the smoke of roasted meat, crushed grain, and limestone dust, the long road toward civilization begins to change direction. Then comes the strangest act of all. After generations of quarrying, carving, raising, gathering, feasting, and returning, the people of Gobekli Tepe begin to bury the very spaces they worked so hard to create. The great enclosures are not simply abandoned to wind and erosion, they are filled. Stone rubble, earth, flint, animal bone, and debris are packed into the spaces around the pillars until the circular rooms disappear beneath a growing mound. The sanctuary becomes its own grave. This deliberate burial is one of the reasons the site survives so well. Had the pillars remained exposed, weather, reuse, later building, and human damage might have destroyed much more of them. Instead, the people who close the enclosures also preserve them, though preservation may not have been their intention. They seal the carved animals in darkness, they cover the faceless pillars, they turn architecture back into hill. Why they do this remains uncertain. Scholars still debate whether the backfilling marks ritual closure, renewal, rebuilding, abandonment, practical leveling, or some combination of all these. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence. The fill contains enormous quantities of material, suggesting repeated activity and intentional effort. This is not the slow drift of natural sediment. It is human action, and it requires labour almost as meaningful as construction itself. To bury a monument is not necessarily to reject it. In many societies, sacred places are closed ceremonially when their use ends. Buildings can be killed, retired, transformed, or returned to the earth. A space may become too powerful, too old, too dangerous, too polluted, too associated with the dead, or simply no longer aligned with changing ritual needs. The people at Gobekli Tepe may not have seen burial as destruction. They may have seen it as completion. The act also suggests that the enclosures had life cycles. They are built, used, modified, and closed. Later structures appear elsewhere or above them. The site changes across time, becoming less a single monument than a long sequence of ritual and social decisions. Earlier circular enclosures give way to smaller rectangular buildings in later phases. The scale shifts. The architecture becomes different. Something in the social world is changing, though the evidence remains incomplete. The buried sanctuary may mark not an end of meaning, but a change in how meaning is organized. One surprising detail is the sheer density of the backfill. It includes limestone chips, broken tools, animal bones, and debris that may come from construction, feasting, and everyday activity. The fill is like a compressed archive of the site's life. It preserves not only the closure of the enclosures but traces of the activities that surrounded them. In a sense, the people bury the stones with fragments of the world that made them possible, the animals eaten, the tools used. The rubble struck from limestone, the residues of gatherings repeated across time. This makes the burial feel almost intimate. The pillars are not sealed in clean emptiness. They are surrounded by the broken remains of labour and meals. The sanctuary is filled with its own past. Every basket of debris dropped into the enclosure adds another layer between the living and the figures below. The central pillars vanish gradually, perhaps first to their waists, then shoulders, then completely. The carved foxes and snakes disappear. Darkness returns. If people watch this process, it must have been powerful. A place once entered becomes inaccessible. A stone figure once seen from below becomes covered by the hands of descendants or successors. These sounds inside the enclosure change as the fill rises. Footsteps become impossible. Walls lose their interior. The space stops being a space and becomes memory. What had been architecture becomes ancestry embedded in the hill. There may also be practical reasons for burial. Later builders could have needed level surfaces for new structures. Filling older enclosures may have stabilized the mound. A changing community may have repurposed the site without thinking in the dramatic terms modern observers prefer. Archaeology must allow for practical action as well as symbolic intention. Yet at Gobekli Tepe, the effort and pattern of backfilling are difficult to reduce to convenience alone. Even practical acts can carry meaning, especially in places already charged with ritual importance. The burial also helps explain why the site remained hidden for so long. Once the enclosures were recovered, later generations may have known only a mound, perhaps still meaningful, perhaps gradually forgotten. Oral memory can last for astonishing periods, but it changes. Stories detach from their original reference. Sacred places become haunted places, ancestral places, ordinary hills or fields. Eventually even memory thins. The mound remains while the reasons for it vanish. By the time later civilizations rise, Gobekli Tepe is already ancient beyond comprehension. When early farmers spread through the region, the buried enclosures may have been forgotten or only dimly remembered. When cities appear in Mesopotamia, the hill is silent. When Egypt's pyramids rise, Gobekli Tepe has already been underground for thousands of years. When empires march across Anatolia, the pillars wait beneath soil and rubble, untouched by the names of kings. This long burial creates one of the great ironies of the site. The people who hide Gobekli Tepe from the world also protect it from the world. Their closure becomes the reason modern archaeologists can stand before carved pillars 12 millennia later. The mystery survives because it was sealed. But burial also complicates interpretation. The material used to fill an enclosure can come from different activities and moments. Dating the fill does not always date the original construction directly. Bones and tools may be older than the burial event or may have been gathered from nearby deposits. Archaeologists must untangle context with care, separating the life of the structure from the life of the materials placed inside it. The evidence remains powerful, but not simple. The deliberate backfilling also raises emotional questions that science can frame but not fully answer. What does it mean for a community to cover its own monumental past? Does it signal a change in belief? A crisis? A reorganization of social life? A generational transition? Did the builders' descendants understand the old enclosures differently from those who first raised them? Did the stones lose power or gain it by being buried? There is a possibility that the burial itself is part of the ritual system. The enclosures may have been meant to be temporary in the long view, their closure anticipated from the beginning. Building, using, and burying could all belong to one cycle. A monument does not have to stand forever to matter. Its making may be the central act. Its burial may lock that act into the earth, fixing memory in place. As the hill grows, Gobekli Tepe becomes less visible and more mysterious. Above ground, the landscape continues to change. People adapt to farming. Villages spread. Domesticated plants and animals become more important. The old wild world carved on the pillars begins to recede, not instantly, but steadily. Below ground, the earlier world remains sealed. Foxes, snakes, boars, scorpions, faceless beings, and the debris of feasts from a time before history's familiar landmarks. The burial of Gobekli Tepe is therefore not a footnote. It is one of the site's defining acts, It tells us that the people who made the hill also remade it, closed it, and transformed it into a mound of memory. They were not passive inhabitants of prehistory, waiting for civilization to happen to them. They shaped their sacred landscape with intention, then reshaped it again by hiding it from sight. And when modern excavation reverses that burial, it does something almost intrusive. It opens a closure never meant for us. It pulls carved animals back into sunlight after 12,000 years and asks them to explain themselves in a language they do not speak. The stones answer with presence, not clarity. They show that something mattered here deeply enough to build, gather, feast, carve, and finally bury. The hill keeps that final gesture at its heart. Gobekli Tepe is not only a place raised before cities, it is a place deliberately returned to earth before the world remembered what a city was. The stones of Gobekli Tepe rise at a moment when the world itself is changing its mind. The last ice age is ending, but not gently. Climate does not move like a smooth curtain lifting from the stage. It jerks, pauses, reverses, warms, cools, dries, floods, and unsettles the patterns on which human life depends. Around the hill, plants shift their ranges, herds alter their movements, springs strengthen or fail, grasslands expand and contract. What earlier generations knew still matters, but it no longer guarantees what will happen next. This is the deep backdrop of Gobekli Tepe, a human world learning to gather more intensely, while the natural world becomes less predictable. The site belongs broadly to the transition after the Younger Dryas, a cold and unstable interval that interrupts the warming at the end of the Pleistocene. For over 1,000 years, conditions in many regions become cooler and drier than the warm period that came just before. Then the climate warms again. The shift is not just a temperature curve in a scientific graph. It changes the availability of water, the distribution of wild cereals, the size and movement of animal populations, and the choices available to human communities. The Younger Dryas has attracted enormous attention because it sits so close to the beginnings of agriculture in Southwest Asia. Some researchers see it as a major pressure that encourages people to manage food resources more actively. If wild plant stands shrink or become less reliable, groups already experimenting with harvesting and storage may intensify those practices. If mobility becomes riskier, staying near dependable resources may become more attractive. If larger social networks help buffer scarcity, gathering places may become more important. The evidence remains incomplete, and climate is never a single master key, but it is impossible to ignore the timing. Gobekli Tepe appears near the end of this unstable world, when warming resumes and early Neolithic lifeways begin to spread. The hill is not simply a response to disaster, and it should not be treated as a monument built by people fleeing one event. Popular theories sometimes leap from the Younger Dryas to global cataclysm, comet impacts, or hidden warnings carved into stone. These ideas often move faster than the evidence allows. Mainstream archaeology is more cautious. It recognizes climate stress and environmental change without turning every symbol into a coded catastrophe report. Still, the climate matters profoundly. Imagine a community whose grandparents remember different landscapes. Valleys that once offered reliable plants may shift. Herds that once appeared at expected times may arrive earlier, later, or not at all. Water sources may become more precious. The rhythm of movement across the land changes. In such a world, a fixed ceremonial center can become more than a place of belief. It can become a place where scattered groups maintain relationships needed for survival. When the land becomes uncertain, People may invest more heavily in the social worlds that help them endure uncertainty. The region around Gobekli Tepe is unusually important because it lies within the natural range of several wild species that later become domesticated. Wild einkorn wheat grows in the broader area, wild barley, legumes, pistachio, almond, and other resources are part of the wider ecological mosaic. Wild sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, and gazelle move through surrounding zones. This does not mean agriculture is inevitable. Many people live alongside domesticable species without domesticating them. But when environmental pressure, population movement, ritual gathering, and repeated harvesting overlap, the relationship between humans and certain plants can begin to shift. Domestication is not an invention in the way a tool is invented. It is a long relationship that changes both sides. People select, protect, gather, sow, and harvest. Plants with traits useful to humans reproduce more often. Over generations, wild cereals become domesticated forms with tougher richices and larger seeds. Animals become smaller, more manageable, and increasingly dependent on human-controlled breeding. None of this happens overnight. In the time of Gobekli Tepe, the process is beginning, unevenly, across a broad landscape. Some groups may cultivate while still hunting heavily. Some may remain mobile. Some may experiment and abandon practices. The transition is patchy and human. A lesser-known detail is that the early Neolithic landscape around Gobekli Tepe is not represented by one site alone. Nearby places, including Karahan Tepe and other so-called Tash Tepele sites, reveal that this region contains a wider network of early monumental and settlement activity. Gobekli Tepe may be the most famous hill, but it's part of a broader phenomenon in which communities across southeastern Anatolia build with stone, carve unusual imagery, and develop new forms of social life. This wider network makes the climate and cultural shift feel less like a single miracle and more like a regional transformation. Climate does not carve pillars. People do. But climate can create the conditions in which old habits no longer feel sufficient. If wild resources become more variable, then cooperation becomes more valuable. If groups gather to exchange information about herds, plants, water, and marriage partners, those gatherings can acquire ritual weight. If ritual gatherings require food, they can intensify harvesting. If intensified harvesting encourages cultivation, then settlement patterns begin to change. The chain is not mechanical, but it is plausible. It shows how environmental change can move through social life, rather than simply forcing behavior from outside. The end of the Ice Age also transforms the symbolic world. Animals that dominated human life for millennia begin to lose ground to fields, corrals, and more managed landscapes. This shift is not instant, and at Gobekli Tepe the wild animal world remains overwhelming. Yet the very act of monumentalizing wild creatures may belong to a moment when relationships with them are changing. The fox, snake, boar, and aurochs may not be nostalgic images, but they stand at the edge of a future in which human control over animals and plants expands dramatically. The old wild order is still present, but the first lines of a new order are being drawn. No single explanation fully accounts for why this happens in this region at this time. Climate instability is one factor, rich natural resources are another. Human population patterns matter, symbolic life matters, technology matters, social competition may matter, memory and ritual matter. The great mistake would be to separate them too neatly. Gobekli Tepe sits exactly where such forces entangle. It is a hill of stone, but also a hill of weather, hunger, abundance, fear, and adaptation. The people who gather there may not think in terms of climate change. They know years, seasons, and stories. They know that certain plants ripen differently. They know that herds move strangely. They know that elders remember other conditions. They know that some gatherings are more difficult to feed than before, or easier in years of abundance. They respond not to abstract global patterns, but to lived experience. Over time, those responses become archaeology. This is why climate turns the key without opening the whole door. It helps explain pressure, but not meaning. It may help explain why people gather more, cultivate more, settle more, and depend more on certain resources. It does not explain why pillars are faceless, why snakes cover stone, why enclosures are buried, or why a hill becomes powerful. For that, climate must be joined to imagination. Environment shapes possibility, but culture chooses among possibilities. Gobekli Tepe stands at the meeting of those forces. The Ice Age loosens its grip. The Younger Dryas disturbs the old rhythm. The Holocene begins, bringing warmer conditions and new ecological opportunities. Human groups respond by gathering, experimenting, building, feasting, and eventually settling in ways that will transform the planet. The hill does not mark the beginning of civilization as a single moment. It marks a threshold where the natural world's instability and the human world's creativity become inseparable. And so the mystery grows larger than the stones. Gobekli Tepe is not only a place older than Egypt, it is a place built while the world that made Egypt possible was still forming, before floodplains become kingdoms, before grain becomes taxation, before gods are written into temple archives. People on a hill in Anatolia are already answering climate, scarcity, abundance, and fear with stone circles full of animals. The weather changes, the land shifts, and human beings do what they have always done at the edge of uncertainty. They gather, they remember, they build. As the world warms and the old patterns loosen, villages begin to harden into the landscape, not all at once, not everywhere, and not with the clean certainty that later maps make possible, but gradually enough that the change becomes irreversible. Places that once receive people seasonally begin to hold them longer. Camps accumulate deeper deposits. Houses become more substantial. Storage becomes more important. The dead are kept closer. Paths return to the same springs. The same grain stands. The same stone sources. The same ridges where memory has already gathered. Gobekli Tepe belongs to this moment of thickening permanence. Around it, across southeastern Anatolia and the wider Fertile Crescent, communities are experimenting with new ways of staying. Some still hunt heavily, some cultivate plants, some manage animals without fully domesticating them, some build circular houses, others create rectangular rooms that fit together more tightly. The shift is uneven, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the direction is clear. Human life is becoming more rooted. Rootedness changes everything. A mobile group can move away from waste, conflict, depleted resources, or sickness. A village cannot move so easily. Once houses, storage pits, graves, and cultivated plots bind people to a place, problems begin to accumulate along with possessions. Neighbours become permanent, disputes linger, food must be defended, water access matters more sharply, disease spreads more easily when people live close together. The advantages of settlement are real, but so are the costs. This is one of the quiet contradictions of early civilization. The move toward village life is often imagined as a comfortable step upward, but for many people it may have meant more work, narrower diets, greater exposure to illness, and new social pressures. Farming creates stability, but it also creates dependence. A failed crop can threaten a settled community in ways that a mobile foraging group might avoid by moving. Storage can reduce hunger, but it can also create inequality. Fields feed people, but they also tie people down. In the region around Gobekli Tepe, the earliest villages do not yet resemble later cities, but they contain the seeds of later social worlds. Houses become more durable. Architecture begins to structure daily life more tightly. Work becomes organized around repeated tasks: grinding grain, tending plants, processing hides, shaping tools, maintaining walls, storing food. The landscape itself changes as people harvest certain plants more heavily, clear areas, encourage useful species, and return to the same locations. The difference between wild and cultivated begins as a blur and only later becomes obvious. A surprising detail from the broader early Neolithic world is the close relationship between houses and the dead. In several early settlements across the Near East, people bury bodies beneath floors or treat skulls in special ways after death. This does not mean every community shares the same belief, but it shows that settlement is not merely economic. To live in a house may also mean living above ancestors. The dead become part of the architecture. A household is not just a shelter. It is a claim on memory, land, and belonging. This matters for understanding Gobekli Tepe because the rise of settled life does not replace ritual. It intensifies it. As people stay longer in one place, they need stronger ways to define who belongs, who owns, who remembers, and who has authority. Ritual can help answer those questions. It can bind a group to a house, a lineage to a burial, a community to a hill, or several communities to a shared monument. The sacred does not fade as practical life becomes more complex. It becomes one of the tools by which complexity is managed. Nearby sites reveal that Gobekli Tepe is not alone in this transformation. Karahan Tepe, Nevalachori, and other early Neolithic places in southeastern Anatolia show related traditions of stone architecture, T-shaped pillars, carved imagery, and communal buildings. Some of these places include clearer evidence of settlement, reminding us that the distinction between ritual center and village is not always sharp. The world of Gobekli Tepe may be a network of communities experimenting with both monumentality and domestic life, each influencing the other. Scholars still debate how these sites relate to one another. Did one tradition spread from a central place? Did neighboring groups independently develop related forms? Were the T-shaped pillars part of a shared symbolic language across the region? The evidence remains incomplete, especially because many sites are only partially excavated or were damaged before full study. But the pattern suggests that Gobekli Tepe is not an isolated miracle. It is the most famous visible peak of a larger cultural landscape. As villages harden, social roles likely become more defined. Some people may become especially skilled at stone carving, ritual performance, food storage, hunting coordination, or plant management. Specialization does not require full-time professions at first. A person can be both hunter and carver, farmer and ritual leader, builder and elder. But repeated settlement allows skill to deepen and recognition to accumulate. Over time, reputation can become authority. Authority can become hierarchy. Hierarchy can become inheritance. The path is not inevitable, but it becomes easier once people remain in place. The relationship between Gobekli Tepe and this village world may be reciprocal. The monument draws people together, encouraging repeated gatherings and shared labor. Those gatherings require food, planning, and social organization. As settlement increases nearby, communities may have more capacity to support construction and ritual. The hill may help create the conditions for rootedness, while rootedness helps sustain the hill. Cause and effect circle around each other. No single explanation fully accounts for this transition. Climate plays a role, but climate does not decide how people arrange houses. Wild cereals matter, but plants do not demand monuments. Ritual matters, but belief alone does not grind grain or store seed. The change occurs because many pressures converge: environmental opportunity, social obligation, memory, food management, demography, and imagination. Gobekli Tepe sits inside that convergence like a stone knot tying several threads together. The human consequence is enormous. Once villages take hold, the scale of human history begins to change. Population can grow. Children survive differently. Land becomes inherited or contested. Food surpluses become possible. Inequality has new places to hide and grow. Cooperation becomes more powerful, but conflict can become more entrenched. The road towards cities, states, armies, writing, and empires begins not with the sudden awakening, but with these small acts of staying, repairing a wall, planting near a house, burying a relative beneath a floor, returning to a communal building, storing grain for a season that has not yet come. Gobekli Tepe stands near the beginning of that long commitment. It is not yet the world of Egypt or Mesopotamia, but it helps reveal the deeper prehistory behind them. Later civilizations will look grander because they leave more visible remains: pyramids, ziggurats, tablets, palaces, canals. But before those visible monuments, there is a quieter transformation in how people relate to place. A hill becomes a center, a house becomes an inheritance, a field becomes a promise and a trap. The old mobile world does not vanish overnight. Hunting continues. Wild foods remain important. People still move, exchange, visit, and adapt. But something has shifted. The future is becoming heavier. It has foundations now. It has stored grain, walls, ancestors under floors, and stone pillars buried in mounds. It has places people cannot easily abandon because too much memory has been invested there. And so the story moves from the open landscape toward the first durable human centers. Gobekli Tepe does not become a city, but it belongs to the same deep movement that makes cities possible. It shows the social gravity forming before urban life appears. The hill gathers people, villages hold them. Between those two forces, humanity begins to cross a threshold from living in landscapes to remaking them. For a long time, civilization was told as a staircase. First came wandering bands, then farming, then villages, then surplus, then temples, priests, rulers, writing, laws, cities, and empires. The model was useful because it gave order to an enormous past, but it also made the past too obedient. It implied that human imagination waited for granaries, that ritual waited for settled life, that monumental building waited for agriculture to provide the leisure. Gobekli Tepe does not destroy the staircase completely, but it breaks several steps and scatters them across the hill. The site shows that people can organize enormous symbolic labor before the full urban package appears. They can gather in large numbers without a city. They can raise stone without kings. They can create charged ritual spaces before writing names the gods. This does not mean civilization begins in a single flash on one hill in Anatolia. It means the process is messier, older, and more deeply human than the clean version allows. The roots of civilization are not only economic, they are social. Emotional, symbolic, and environmental all at once. Agriculture remains central. Without farming, later cities cannot feed dense populations for long. Grain storage, land management, animal domestication, and predictable surplus eventually make states possible. But Gobekli Tepe suggests that farming is not simply the first cause from which everything else follows. Ritual gatherings, feasting, social prestige, seasonal congregation, and shared belief may have helped create the demand for more reliable food. In that view, the temple does not wait passively for the village. The sanctuary and the village grow in conversation. This is why the site feels so disruptive. It forces scholars to take pre-agricultural and early agricultural communities seriously as creators of complex institutions, even when those institutions leave no writing. A place like Gobekli Tepe may not have laws, taxes, or armies, but it has rules. People do not raise pillars in carefully arranged enclosures without shared expectations. There must be knowledge about where stones belong, who participates, how gatherings unfold, what animals matter. When older spaces are closed, and why certain acts must be repeated, those rules are invisible now, but the architecture depends on them. A lesser known but important point is that some early interpretations of Gobekli Tepe have been revised as excavation, and regional research continue. The simple image of an isolated temple used only by wandering hunter-gatherers has become more complicated. Evidence from the broader site and neighbouring places suggests a world where ritual and habitation may overlap more than first thought. This does not make the discovery less important. It makes it more realistic. Human life rarely separates sacred and ordinary activity into neat zones. The same place can be a gathering centre, workplace, memory site, and living landscape. The myth of sudden civilization often survives because later states are loud in the archaeological record. Kings carve their names, cities leave ruins, bureaucracies leave tablets, farmers reshape entire valleys. But early social complexity can be quieter. It may appear in repeated gatherings, shared symbols, unusual burials, long-distance exchange, carefully made floors, carved pillars, and the coordination of a labour without written command. Gobekli Tepe reminds us that the absence of writing is not the absence of history. It is only the absence of one kind of record. Scholars still debate how far to push this lesson. Some argue that Gobekli Tepe marks a profound ritual revolution. Others caution that it should not be treated as the birthplace of religion or civilization. Humans have symbolic life tens of thousands of years earlier. Cave art, burials, ornaments, figurines, and long-distance exchange all show deep cognitive and social complexity long before the Neolithic. What makes Gobekli Tepe different is not that humans suddenly become symbolic, but that symbolic life becomes architectural on a new scale in a region where settlement and food production are also changing. That distinction matters. The hill is not the first sign of human imagination. It is one of the earliest known signs of monumental communal architecture. It shows imagination becoming fixed in stone, tied to place, and sustained across generations. This is a crucial shift. A painted body moves away. A song disappears when memory fails. A temporary ritual space can vanish without trace. A stone enclosure remains, gathers debris, demands maintenance, and alters how later people encounter the landscape. Monumentality gives memory a body. Once memory has a body, society changes. People can return to what ancestors built. They can inherit obligations to a place. They can compete with older monuments by building new ones. They can bury the past or renovate it. They can use architecture to make claims that outlast a single lifetime. Later civilizations will do this constantly, but Gobekli Tepe shows the habit beginning before the state. It is not yet empire, but it is already permanence. The old staircase also tends to imagine progress as inevitable. Gobekli Tepe resists that too. Its world does not simply become ours. The people who built the great enclosures eventually bury them. The tradition changes. Some forms disappear. Other communities develop in different directions. There is no straight road from Pillar 43 to the pyramids. No direct line from a carved fox to a pharaoh's crown. The connection is deeper and less literal. Gobekli Tepe reveals the kind of social and symbolic capacities from which later civilizations can grow, not a blueprint for those civilizations. No single explanation fully accounts for civilization's emergence because civilization is not one invention. It is a bundle of changes that become entangled sedentism, cultivation, domestication, storage, ritual authority, territoriality, exchange, specialization, inequality, and memory fixed in durable forms. Different places combine these elements differently. In some regions, farming precedes monuments. In others, communal ritual architecture appears very early. The global story is not one staircase, but many uneven paths across different landscapes. Gobekli Tepe's power lies in how dramatically it exposes that unevenness. It shows humans doing something that the old model placed too late. It shows complexity before the usual evidence for hierarchy. It shows monumentality before pottery. It shows a centre before a city. And because it is so old, it forces a humbler view of the unknown. If a hill in Turkey could hide such a world until the 1990s, then the deep past may contain other forms of complexity still buried, eroded, flooded, or misunderstood. The lesson is not that everything we knew was wrong. Archaeology rarely works that way. The lesson is that models must bend when new evidence appears. Farming remains crucial, climate remains crucial, settlement remains crucial, but belief, gathering, and symbolic labour must stand beside them, not after them. Human beings do not become meaning-making creatures only once they have surplus grain. They carry meaning into the fields before the fields fully exist. And that may be the deepest correction Gobekli Tepe offers. Civilization is not born only from need. It is also born from attention, fear, memory, obligation, imagination, and the desire to gather around something larger than daily survival. The first cities will come later, with their walls and markets and temples and rulers, but before them, on a limestone hill, people are already making a centre of the world. The more Gobekli Tepe is studied, the more it resists becoming a single tidy answer. It is tempting to make the hill stand for one great idea: religion before farming, temples before cities, civilization older than expected, or a lost message from the end of the Ice Age. But the site is too complicated for a slogan. Its stones belong to many centuries. Its structures change. Its imagery is dense and not fully readable. Its relationship to settlement remains debated. Its burial is deliberate but not fully explained. Every interpretation catches part of the hill and leaves another part in shadow. The most influential explanation sees Gobekli Tepe as a ritual centre, where groups gathered from across the region. In this view, the hill is not a normal village but a special place, perhaps used seasonally for ceremonies, feasts, exchange, and social bonding. The architecture supports this possibility. The enclosures are monumental, symbolically charged, and centred on imposing pillars. The animal imagery feels ceremonial rather than domestic. The scale of feasting and construction suggests gatherings larger than a small household. What survives in the record suggests that the site helped bind communities together before urban institutions existed. Yet even this strong explanation has limits. Later research complicates the idea of a completely isolated sanctuary with no everyday life around it. Evidence from the wider site and nearby early Neolithic places indicates that habitation, ritual, and communal architecture may have overlapped. Some buildings once called temples may have had more varied uses. Some spaces may have served communities living nearby, not only distant pilgrims. Scholars still debate how much of Gobekli Tepe was special-purpose ritual architecture, and how much belonged to daily or seasonal settlement. The older picture may have been too clean. Another explanation emphasizes social competition. Monumental building can be a way for groups to display power, generosity, skill, or access to labor. Feasts can create prestige. Carvings can mark group identities. Pillars can become statements of belonging or rivalry. In this view, Gobekli Tepe is not only sacred but social and political, though not political in the later sense of kings and states. It may represent a world where ambitious individuals or groups gain influence by organizing work and ceremony. The evidence for hierarchy remains indirect, but the possibility of competition is difficult to dismiss. A third explanation looks at the dead, across parts of the early Neolithic Near East. Human remains are treated in complex ways, especially skulls. Some communities remove skulls after burial, plaster them, display them, or circulate them in ritual contexts. Gobekli Tepe itself has yielded limited but intriguing evidence of human remains, including modified skull fragments that some researchers interpret as part of special mortuary practices. This does not prove that the site is a cemetery or ancestor temple, but it suggests that death, memory, and bodily transformation may be part of its symbolic world. The faceless pillars may stand in some relationship to ancestors or powerful beings, though certainty remains out of reach. The animal imagery has its own field of debate. Some scholars interpret the creatures as mythic beings, clan symbols, protective forces, dangerous species, or markers of ritual stories. Others warn against overreading. The carvings are meaningful, but meaning does not survive automatically. A snake may not mean the same thing across societies. A bird may belong to a death ritual in one context and a seasonal story in another. Popular interpretations often claim to solve the imagery by linking it to constellations or catastrophic events, especially the Younger Dryas. These theories are disputed, and many rely on selective comparisons. They may be imaginative, but imagination is not evidence. That caution matters because Gobekli Tepe has become a magnet for unsupported claims. Its age, mystery, and monumental character make it irresistible to stories about lost advanced civilizations, ancient aliens, forgotten global codes, and survivors of catastrophes carrying secret knowledge. These ideas thrive because the site genuinely feels astonishing. But astonishment does not require abandoning archaeology. The stones are impressive precisely because they were made by early Neolithic humans using known materials, tools, and social cooperation. To credit the builders with their own achievement is more powerful than replacing them with fantasy. No single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence because Gobekli Tepe is not one thing frozen in one moment. It is a long-lived place whose meaning likely changes over time. Early enclosures may serve different purposes from later buildings. A carving made in one generation may be understood differently by another. A space used for initiation may later become a memory site. A ritual center may attract settlement. A settlement may maintain a communal sanctuary. The hill is not a noun so much as a process. One lesser-known detail that captures this complexity is the regional spread of related sites in southeastern Anatolia. Places such as Karahan Tepe show that T-shaped pillars and unusual carved imagery are not exclusive to Gobekli Tepe. This broader pattern suggests a shared symbolic or architectural tradition across multiple communities. If Gobekli Tepe is part of a network, then its meaning may depend on relationships between places. The hill may be one node in a landscape of ritual centers, settlements, and memory sites rather than the single origin point of everything. This regional view changes the scale of the mystery. The question is no longer only why one hill has strange pillars. It becomes why an entire region begins producing monumental stone architecture at this early date. Are communities becoming more interconnected? Are shared rituals spreading? Are groups competing through construction? Are new forms of identity emerging as people settle and cultivate? The evidence remains incomplete, especially because many sites are still under excavation. But the wider pattern suggests a cultural horizon more complex than one isolated discovery could reveal. The debate also extends to whether Gobekli Tepe is best understood through religion at all. The word religion carries baggage from literate civilizations' gods, doctrines, priests, sacred texts, temples, offerings. The builders of Gobekli Tepe may have had none of these in recognizable form. Their practices may have involved myth, ancestors, animals, landscape powers, initiation, feasting, and social identity without separating them into a category called religion. Modern terms are useful, but they can distort. The hill may represent a way of living in which ritual, ecology, politics, art, and food are inseparable. Archaeologists therefore move carefully between what is known and what is inferred. Known the site is very old, monumental, carved, repeatedly used, and deliberately buried. Known many animal remains are wild, and the imagery is dominated by wild creatures. Known the architecture required substantial labour and planning. Inferred large gatherings likely occurred. Rituals were probably central, and the site played a major role in early Neolithic social life. Unknown the names of the builders, their language, their myths, the identities of the pillars, the exact ceremonies performed, and the reasons for final burial. This boundary between knowledge and mystery is where Gobekli Tepe is most compelling. It does not invite certainty, it invites disciplined wonder. The site is not a blank screen for any theory one wishes to project. It is a body of evidence, stubborn and specific, but incomplete. The responsible imagination must stay close to stone, bone, soil, and context. And so the debates continue because the hill deserves them. It is too old and too important to be flattened into one explanation. It may be sanctuary, gathering place, feast ground, ancestor site, social arena, construction project, memory machine, and settlement landscape all at once. Its strangeness does not come from being impossible. It comes from being possible earlier than expected, in forms that later history taught us not to expect. Gobekli Tepe remains powerful because it stands between evidence and silence. It gives enough to overturn assumptions, but not enough to close the case. It shows carved animals, but not the stories behind them. It shows pillars, but not the songs, gestures, or fears that animated them. It shows burial, but not the final ceremony. It shows a centre before a city, but not the name by which its builders knew it. That is why scholars still debate, and why the debate is not a failure. It is the sound of the deep past refusing to become simple. The buried hill does not lead directly to Egypt, but it changes the depth beneath Egypt. It does not become Mesopotamia, but it lengthens the shadow behind Mesopotamia. Gobekli Tepe is not the first city, not the first kingdom, not the first written civilization, and not the hidden capital of some vanished empire. its importance is stranger than that. It reveals that the worlds later called ancient were themselves built on a much older human inheritance, one formed before kings learned to count grain, before priests wrote temple lists, before architects stacked pyramids toward the sun. When the first cities of southern Mesopotamia rise thousands of years later, they seem to appear with a power entirely different from the stone circles of southeastern Anatolia. Uruk, Eridu, Ur, and other early urban centers belong to floodplains, irrigation, temples, workshops, trade, writing, and administration. Their monuments are tied to grain economies and labor systems far more formal than anything visible at Gobekli Tepe. Yet the deeper pattern is familiar. People gather around sacred centers, invest labor in architecture, use ritual to organize society, and make places that outlast individuals. The tools have changed, the scale has changed, the logic of permanence has not disappeared. Egypt, too, emerges from a very different landscape. The Nile creates a rhythm unlike the hills around Gobekli Tepe annual floods, fertile banks, desert boundaries, river transport, and eventually a state capable of mobilizing enormous labor. The pyramids are not simply bigger versions of Neolithic pillars. They belong to kingship, taxation, astronomy, mortuary theology, and a literate administration. But when people say Gobekli Tepe is older than Egypt, the real meaning is not that it replaces Egypt's grandeur. It shows that monumental imagination has a prehistory far older than pharaohs. That prehistory matters because later civilizations often make themselves look like beginnings. Kings claim to found order from chaos. Cities present themselves as centers of the world. Temples declare that divine authority rests there. Writing preserves the voices of elites and makes their world seem primary. But Gobekli Tepe reminds us that before all of that, people without writing are already creating centers, symbols, and collective memories. Later civilizations inherit more from the deep past than they know. A surprising detail is how many features associated with later complex societies have quieter, earlier forms. Communal labor exists before taxation. Ritual authority exists before priestly bureaucracy. Long-distance exchange exists before merchant classes. Architecture creates memory before royal inscriptions. Special places structure identity before cities draw walls around neighborhoods. None of these early forms are identical to later institutions, but they show that civilization does not begin from nothing. It crystallizes older human habits into harder, more formal shapes. This is where Gobekli Tepe becomes less a single mystery and more a lens. Through it, the ancient world looks layered instead of sudden. The ziggurat has ancestors in communal building traditions. The temple has ancestors in gathering places without written gods. The royal monument has ancestors in stone raised by people whose leaders, if they had them, left no names. The city has ancestors in centers that draw people before they permanently hold them. What survives in the records suggests continuity not of culture, but of human capacity. There is no evidence that Egyptians knew Gobekli Tepe, or that Mesopotamian scribes remembered its rituals. The site was buried long before their civilizations matured. Any direct line would be unsupported, but influence does not have to be direct to be meaningful. The deeper continuity lies in the long transformation from mobile foraging worlds into settled, symbolic, agricultural, and eventually urban worlds across Southwest Asia and beyond. Gobekli Tepe stands near one early turning point in that transformation. Egypt and Mesopotamia stand much later, when the consequences have become visible on a massive scale. The legacy of the hill is therefore intellectual as much as historical. It changes what scholars look for. It encourages archaeologists to take early Neolithic ritual architecture seriously. It widens attention beyond famous river valleys to upland regions, hunter-gatherer networks, and transitional communities. It warns against assuming that the absence of writing means the absence of complexity. It shows that some of the most important human changes occur before anyone records them in words. Scholars still debate how much Gobekli Tepe should reshape the grand narrative. Some caution against making it the origin of everything. That caution is necessary. Civilization does not begin at one site, in one enclosure, or with one carved animal. But the hill does force a deeper timeline for organized symbolic life. It shows that humans are capable of building shared worlds in stone long before the political machinery of states appears. That is not a small revision. It changes the atmosphere of prehistory. The later world is full of echoes, but they are faint and indirect. A temple courtyard in Mesopotamia, a pyramid complex in Egypt, a stone circle in Europe, a ceremonial mound in another continent. None need descend from Gobekli Tepe to share a broad human impulse. People gather. They mark certain places as different. They build higher, deeper, heavier, and more durable than daily need requires. They turn labor into memory. They create forms that say, in stone or earth, that something unseen must be acknowledged. Gobekli Tepe is one of the earliest places where that impulse becomes monumental on such a scale. Its builders do not leave descendants who call themselves by its name. They do not found an empire. Their sanctuary is buried. Their language dissolves. But the possibility they reveal remains. Human beings are not waiting for civilization to become symbolic. They are symbolic first, and civilization grows partly from that condition. No single explanation fully accounts for the long movement from Gobekli Tepe to later ancient worlds. The path runs through climate change, farming, settlement, domestication, migration, conflict, exchange, invention, disease, hierarchy, and belief. It bends through countless communities whose names are gone. Some succeed for a time, some vanish, some are absorbed into others, some leave only ash, bones, or stone. The later brightness of Egypt and Mesopotamia rests on this enormous unseen foundation. That is the legacy beneath the legacy. The famous civilizations are not less impressive because older monuments exist. They are more deeply connected to the long human struggle to make meaning durable. Egypt still astonishes. Mesopotamia still transforms history. But Gobekli Tepe adds depth below them, like discovering that a mountain has roots far underground. The summit remains visible, but the structure beneath it is suddenly larger than anyone imagined. And so the hill becomes a reminder that history's beginnings are often illusions created by surviving evidence. Writing makes a beginning seem official. Kings make a beginning seem intentional. Cities make a beginning seem visible. But long before the first official beginnings, people are already shaping the world in ways that later ages will inherit without remembering. The earliest roots are buried not only under soil, but under the arrogance of timelines that begin too late. Gobekli Tepe does not give us a lost civilization older than Egypt. It gives us something more grounded and more unsettling, a civilization of impulses before civilization of institutions. A world where people gather around stone beings without cities, create symbols without writing, build centers without states, and bury their most powerful places before history has learned to speak. The echoes beneath later worlds are not loud, but they are there. They sound like limestone struck by flint, like feet climbing a hill, like animal bones cracking near a fire, like the first heavy stones of memory being raised into the open air. Gobekli Tepe is often called a city older than Egypt, but the phrase is both useful and wrong. Useful, because it captures the shock of finding monumental architecture thousands of years before the pyramids. Wrong, because the hill is not a city in any ordinary sense. It has no known streets, no dense neighborhoods, no market quarter, no palace, no city wall, no administrative tablets, no royal cemetery. It does not behave like Uruk, Memphis, or any later urban center. And yet calling it simply a shrine or sanctuary feels too small, as if one were trying to fit a storm into a cup. The place remains powerful precisely because it stands between categories. It is not a city, but it creates a center. It is not a state, but it organizes labor. It is not a written civilization, but it speaks through symbols. It is not a farming village in its earliest form, but it belongs to the world from which farming villages will grow. It is not a temple in the later sense, but it is charged with ritual force. The old words fail because the hill comes from a time before the institutions those words were made to describe. This may be the final lesson of Gobekli Tepe. The past is not obligated to match the boxes created from later history. Cities are not the only places where complexity lives. States are not the only systems capable of coordination. Writing is not the only form of memory. A civilization can vanish so completely that no name survives. But the human acts beneath it can still be visible: gathering, carving, feasting, building, burying, returning. The phrase city older than Egypt also carries another danger. It can make the discovery sound like a hidden rival to Egypt, as though history were a competition in age and grandeur. Gobekli Tepe does not need to defeat the pyramids to matter. Its importance is not that it is bigger, more advanced, or secretly superior. Its importance is that it is earlier in a different way. It reveals a form of complexity before the familiar machinery of civilization appears. It shows human beings creating monumentality from social imagination rather than state power. The central enclosures are therefore best understood not as proof of a lost empire, but as evidence of a world where communal life is already intensely organized around meaning. The builders do not leave us kings, but they leave hierarchy in stone. They do not leave us scripture, but they leave repeated symbols. They do not leave us city plans, but they leave a landscape shaped by return. They do not leave us explanations, but they leave acts so deliberate that explanation becomes unavoidable. What survives in the record suggests that Gobekli Tepe is part of a wider early Neolithic transformation in southeastern Anatolia. Other sites complicate and enrich the story. The hill is not alone, and it is not magic. Its builders are human communities responding to climate change, wild resources, social obligations, ritual needs, and the emerging pull of settled life. But this grounding does not make the site less mysterious. It makes the mystery more profound. Because it belongs to real people rather than fantasy. Scholars still debate the details. How many people gathered there? How far did they travel? Were the central pillars, ancestors, spirits, social symbols, or something else entirely? Did feasting help push cultivation? Or did changing food practices make feasting possible? Why were the enclosures buried? How did the meaning of the place change over centuries? The evidence remains incomplete, and future excavations may revise parts of the story again. Gobekli Tepe is not a solved riddle. It is a rare opening into a time that usually leaves only scattered fragments. A lesser known but important truth is that most of the site remains unexcavated. Archaeology today often chooses restraint as carefully as discovery. Leaving parts of Gobekli Tepe buried allows future researchers with better methods to ask better questions. The hill is not only an archive of the past, it is a responsibility in the present. Every trench reveals something, but every trench also destroys the original context it studies. The mystery survives partly because scholars do not rush to empty the mound completely. That patience suits the place. Gobekli Tepe itself was made and unmade slowly. It gathered centuries into stone and then hid them under fill. It was never meant to be understood quickly. Its deepest power lies not in a single answer, but in the way it changes the questions. Instead of asking when civilization begins, perhaps the better question is how many beginnings civilization has. One begins with seed and field. One begins with house and hearth. One begins with ancestor and grave. One begins with feast and obligation. One begins with stone raised on a hill before anyone knows the word city. In that sense, Gobekli Tepe is a city that was not a city because it performs one of the city's oldest functions before cities exist. It gathers people into a shared centre. It makes landscape social. It gives memory weight. Later cities will do this with walls, streets, markets, temples, and law. Gobekli Tepe does it with limestone pillars, wild animals, open sky, and the labour of people whose names are gone. This strangeness remains. A place older than Egypt was found, and it did not reveal a neat origin story. It revealed a human threshold. On one side lies the long world of hunters, gatherers, seasonal movement, wild animals, and flexible survival. On the other side lie villages, fields, domestication, storage, hierarchy, and eventually cities. Gobekli Tepe stands in the crossing, not fully belonging to either side. That is why it feels so alive. It is not a relic of a completed stage. It is a record of transformation in motion. The faceless pillars still refuse to explain themselves. The animals still move across stone without translation. The buried enclosures still suggest closure without revealing the ceremony. But perhaps their silence is part of their honesty. Most of human history is silent. Most people who ever lived left no names, no inscriptions, no monuments, no descendants who could identify them. Gobekli Tepe is extraordinary because it lets some of that silent majority become visible, not as shadows, but as builders. And so the hill remains what it has been since excavation first exposed its stones, a challenge to easy beginnings. It is older than Egypt, but not because it is Egypt before Egypt. It is older than the categories that make Egypt legible. It belongs to a time when people are inventing permanence without knowing where permanence will lead. They raise stone beings in circles, surround them with wild animals, gather under changing skies, and then bury the whole place as if returning power to the earth. The city that was not a city leaves no map of streets, but it changes the map of history. It shows that before civilization has walls, it has centres. Before it has kings, it has obligations. Before it has writing, it has memory. Before it has fields, it has feasts. And before it has cities, it has people standing together on a hill, looking at stone, animal, sky, and one another, sensing that the world is becoming different. The hill grows quiet again. After all the dates, stones, theories, and arguments, Gobekli Tepe returns to something simpler and harder to hold: a rise of earth beneath a wide sky. Where people once gathered before the world had cities to gather them, its pillars no longer stand in their first darkness. Its animals have returned to light. but the people who made them remain beyond reach, close enough to feel human, distant enough to remain unknowable. That distance is the shape of deep time. It does not erase everything equally. It takes voices first, then names, then gestures, songs, warnings, and private griefs. It leaves harder things behind: stone, bone, ash, broken tools, traces of meals, foundations under soil. From these fragments, a world has to be rebuilt carefully, with humility, not as fantasy, not as a finished answer, as a landscape of possibilities bounded by evidence. Gobekli Tepe reminds us that civilization is fragile, but also that the human impulse to make meaning is very old. Long before empires, people are already asking the land to remember. They are already making places where the living gather around what they cannot fully explain. They are already turning labor into ceremony and ceremony into memory. They are already building futures they cannot imagine. And then, as all people do, they disappear. The stones remain. The hill covers them. Grass grows over the buried rings. Animals cross the mound. Seasons pass in numbers no human mind can comfortably hold. Egypt rises and falls. Cities burn and rebuild. Languages spread, fracture, vanish. The sanctuary under the hill waits through all of it, not preserving a message exactly, but preserving a question. What were humans before history began speaking for them? Gobekli Tepe does not answer completely. It only opens the ground and lets the question breathe. It shows that the beginning was not simple, not small, and not silent in the way people once imagined. It was crowded with wild animals, shared meals, difficult work, changing weather, buried places, and the first heavy shapes of collective memory. And perhaps that is enough. A city older than Egypt was found, and then everything got strange because the past became larger. Not stranger in the sense of impossible, but stranger in the sense of more human than expected, more inventive, more symbolic, more unfinished. The final image is not a lost empire or a secret code. It is a hill at dusk, limestone cooling after heat, carved animals resting in shadow, and somewhere beneath the earth, the silence of people who built a center before the world knew what a city was.